You are into the debate of net neutrality in the United States. In Germany and Europe, we have a bit this discussion, but not so big as in the United States. What's the matter on net neutrality and why is it in danger?
It's a hard question to answer briefly because there's a lot of history. But the shortest version of an answer, I think, goes something like this. The Internet gets born in the United States in a context of relatively heavy regulation, in the sense that most people use telephones to connect to the Internet, the first part of the Internet. And the telephone system is regulated by the government, so that the telephone companies are not permitted to discriminate against people using their telephone to fake a computer out and dial up a modem and connect over the telephone wires. They're not able to discriminate against those people in favor of people who use a telephone just to talk. The government says you have to treat these uses neutrally, the same, and that forced regulation creates the opportunity for the Internet to get layered on top of a telephone network. I mean, not all parts of it, obviously. The trunk, the broadband, the backbone is laid independently of the telephone wires, but people's last mile ability to connect to the Internet is enabled because they can call up on the telephone. Now, ironically, in many parts of Europe, at the same time that this freedom is guaranteed by regulation in the United States, it doesn't exist in many parts of Europe. In many parts of Europe, for much of the 1990s, it's a crime to use your telephone to connect to a computer, right? Because they want to be able to charge different prices for that and be able to discriminate and control that application so that the telephone companies can profit off of it. But the United States sets the lead by requiring this neutrality, and that invites the growth of the Internet and the explosion of innovation on the Internet. Well, an obsession with a kind of deregulation has taken over in the United States for at least the last 8 years. And over that period of time, in the broadband sector, there's been more and more deregulation of broadband, by which that means that the providers of that infrastructure no longer are required to behave neutrally with respect to people who want to use or get access to that infrastructure. So initially, cable broadband is free of any regulation on how people get access to or use broadband across cable. And since August 5th, 2005, DSL has now been set free of any regulation. So broadband in the United States, there's some technical transition because of mergers, but effectively broadband in the United States since August 5th, 2005 has been free of any regulation for neutrality. So what that means is the providers of broadband, which are an increasingly small set of companies, are now free to pick and choose the content that they'll allow to flow on the broadband network. And they will pick and choose based on what makes them the most money. So they'll say to companies that want to provide video, okay, you want your video to come across in a high quality way, you have to pay a certain video tax. Now that's not a problem for companies like Google, but it will be a problem for companies like Blip TV or, last year, YouTube, right? Companies that are competing with the established companies. It will be harder for them to be able to pay these taxes imposed on access to the Internet relative to the existing successful companies. So as these broadband providers layer these burdens of tax on the network, it will slow down innovation and development for the network because it will benefit the established over the new. And so what net neutrality regulation basically tries to do is to layer a relatively thin rule on top of the Internet that basically tries to drive broadband providers out of business models that are focused on profiting from scarcity into business models that are focused on improving the access and quality of the Internet for everybody. Because again, think about the incentives a broadband provider has in a world where he's allowed to pick and choose the content that comes across the network. So let's say you say, okay, we're going to charge a special price for video. And that price is a price that you have to pay in order to get high quality video across our network. Well, as the provider, you have a couple incentives. You want to make sure that you continue to people continue to have an incentive to pay you a special price. The only way they have a special incentive to pay you a special price is if the ordinary internet is no good for sending video across. Right? If the ordinary internet becomes really good for sending video across, why would you pay for the premium? Right? So, in that context, the provider has a perverse incentive to actually keep the ordinary internet bad in order to make the premium internet worth it. Right? And so you no longer have an incentive to build the fastest network you can. You have an incentive to keep the network, the public internet, bad so that the private internet becomes valuable. Well, that's exactly the kind of business model or incentive we don't want the providers of the internet to have, because it slows the incentive to build really fast internet. Now, paradoxically, Europe embraced a regulatory strategy, which initially the United States had in the 1996 Telecom Act, that has forced much better broadband competition in Europe than in the United States. And so broadband is cheaper and faster in Europe than it is in the United States, especially in Asia. And that, I think, is partly a response to this regulatory strategy. So you don't need network neutrality regulation in Europe, because you actually have more substantive regulations achieving the same end in Europe. So Europe's not talking about network neutrality because you've got other regulations doing basically the same thing. It's an important issue in the United States because we have no regulations governing broadband provision, and that means you have a real incentive for broadband companies to play games with how they develop the internet, contrary to the objective of economic growth overall.